I have been having such a good time diving into your work in lots of different ways. I took your Healthy Deviant quiz this morning, and my results indicated that I am we have to pull them up. Was it like a diehard deviant? What was it? I was a hardcore. I'm a hardcore healthy deviant. And we can get the link for this quiz, but some of the questions that you ask, I'll put the link in the show notes, but some of the questions you ask are things like, do you take a wide variety of proactive steps to maintain and improve your health? Are some of your health promoting behaviors considered quirky or odd by others? And that was a definite yes for me. And does your interest in health and fitness extend beyond your concern with your physical appearance, which I really appreciated too. So tell our listeners a little bit about what a healthy deviant is.
Well, yeah. So you're referencing what I call the spectrum of healthy deviance. We now understand that most things exist on a spectrum. And so, healthy deviant, the definition of a healthy deviant, is someone who willingly defies our unhealthy society's norms and defaults in order to achieve a higher than average level of resilience and vitality and autonomy. What that really means is that a healthy deviant is anybody who is refusing to go along with the so-called normal status quo that is making most people in our culture physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually sick. And I point out that statistically speaking, really, deviance is defined as doing something other than the majority normal, so-called normal does. And in our society, the majority of people are not healthy or happy. 50% of people are chronically ill, or at least diagnosed with at least one chronic illness, and many, many people have many more than one. And a lot of people have chronic illnesses who haven't been diagnosed. So we now know that number climbed up to about 60% during the pandemic. And I think it hasn't come down. So chronic illness is actually much higher than when I wrote the book and had the statistic of 50%. That alone would be enough to make you a minority, basically, relative to the general population, if you were just not diagnosed with a chronic illness. But I share a lot of numbers in my book that talk about the fact that 80% of people aren't thriving mentally or emotionally. And again, that number went up to 89% during the pandemic. We don't know if it's going to be coming down soon. I hope so. But the kind of stunner number is that 97% plus 97.3% at last check of US adults were not practicing even the most basic healthy habits that would be required of them to stay healthy and happy over the long haul. When I did this math and I started looking at the fact that literally a single digit percentage of people are healthy and happy and on track to stay that way by virtue of their healthy habits, it really blew my mind that I was like, wait a minute, there's probably only between 1% and 3% of people who are really healthy and happy for the long haul. And that means that 99% of people or so are struggling or suffering at some level and are probably going to struggle more as our society continues to accelerate its pace of change and its various stresses grow. So for me, healthy deviance is just a description of the way that people like you and I and many of our friends and family are either choosing to live or striving to live, but often in the face of such extraordinary obstacles that it proves relatively difficult to do. So I often say it's like doing the nearly impossible. How do you go about doing that in a culture like ours? And healthy deviance is the art of that, mastering the art of being healthy even in an unhealthy world.
So the deviance part is not only that you're a deviant in that you're different than the majority of the population, which is unhealthy, but you're also a deviant in terms of some of the behaviors that you're doing.
Yes.
And I really appreciated your discussion about the um, unhealthy default reality. And you had this series of statements in the book about what is the unhealthy default reality. It's the rash
Mm.
and the anti-itch cream. It's the dark circles
Yeah.
under your eyes and the 260 kinds of under eye concealer. It's all the noise and the headphones that we wear to cover it up. We have this lack of health, but then all the things that we're doing to try and manage our health are actually making us sicker and aren't leading us to where we want to be in terms of healthy. So can you talk about this unhealthy default reality and how it contributes to the problem?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that passage. It came out of me one day and it kind of just I don't know. It's one of those strange things you feel like you're translating from somewhere else. That
Yeah.
description of it's this and this, the intervention. So, I describe the unhealthy default reality is basically just my term for our unhealthy society. And what I mean by it is that the so-called normal defaults, the things that are easy, accessible, automatic, path of least resistance, tend to be unhealthy choices or unhealthy options. And if you are willing to go along with the default choice, you'll just basically start declining in health and happiness over the course of your lifetime. And if you don't want to go along with the default and you want to make the healthier choice, you're actually going to have to go against the grain. You're going to have to go against the norms, and you'll have to go out of your way, probably spend more time, more energy, more money, more attention, and potentially risk social judgment from other people for being weird by getting away from that default. So, as a deviant, as a healthy deviant, you're always a little outside the unhealthy default reality, but you're living in the midst of it constantly and surrounded by it. And it's always trying to suck you back in because it wants you. The unhealthy default reality would love to have your money and resources and energy and so on. So what happens is that we end up following along the norms that are presented to us. And if and when we do that, we end up with what I call unhealthy default reality problems, the problems that naturally result from living in that way. And those are things like we all recognize as the problems of our day, like burnout and depression and anxiety, weight problems, skin problems, digestive problems, chronic pain, and so on. Lack of energy, lack of enthusiasm. What happens then is that the unhealthy default reality says, oh, you have a problem, Diana. You have fill in the blank, a rash, a weight problem, blah, blah, blah. Now I'm going to present you with a solution to that problem. And we all know how we get targeted on by ads on the basis of whatever we've Googled recently or whatever age bracket we're in, our gender, our interests. So suddenly the unhealthy default reality is saying, for your problem, Diana, we present you with a solution. And it's typically an unhealthy default reality solution. I put the solution in quote marks because typically the solutions that are presented by the unhealthy default reality either don't work at all, they don't really acknowledge the root cause of the problem, they don't work for very long because they require energy and interventions that we can't sustain from a depleted place, or maybe even get started on from a depleted place. Or they just simply run out of steam when we start getting, our demands of other being pulled in other directions. We lose track of the thing, we lose steam, we lose intention and awareness, and then suddenly we find ourselves back with the same or worse problem, and we're blaming ourselves on top of it for having failed. Like we tried, we failed, it didn't work, and now we're looking for the next unhealthy default reality solution, another quick fix, another prescription or subscription or app or charm bracelet. And I want to be clear that there are solutions that are, offered to us that can help with the symptoms of the unhealthy default reality problems, and in the short term, something like an antidepressant or an anti-itch medication or a dietary intervention or a new workout program or a meditation program, these things can be helpful. And they often don't really get at the reality that most of us are living in ways that are unsustainable, largely unendurable. And so we are having to compensate all of the time. The other problem with the unhealthy default reality solutions is that they tend to drain us of our money, our time, our energy, and so on. So we find ourselves more and more vulnerable as we proceed with this exchange of problem, solution, try, fail, depletion, try, fail, depletion. We end up in a downward spiral. I call it the vicious cycle of the unhealthy default reality. And it's really a setup for failure. So what happens is as we keep trying and keep failing and keep getting more and more depleted, we start spiraling down toward a condition that you as a psychologist will know well, called learned helplessness. And this is the basic feeling that no matter what you do, you can't really change the conditions that you're suffering from. Eventually they lose hope or they lose willingness to keep trying because it's just depleting them more. And that's a condition I love to help people out of. I love to help them reframe and see that there is a way out. That way out is, in my mind, healthy deviance, and it's a virtuous cycle rather than a vicious one. But it's a radical reorienting of what we think of as the problem or our problem. And I think the biggest piece of that radical reorientation is realizing that it is not something that's wrong with you. This is something that's wrong with the culture that we're living in, and we are a living experiment trying a way of living that's never been done before. And we're going to have to learn new skills to survive and thrive in this new era.
Yes, I live up in Santa Barbara, and we have a lot of vineyards up here. And
Yeah.
oftentimes, what a farmer will do is plant a rose bush at the end of the vineyard. And the reason why they do that is that the rose bush will get sick first if there's some kind of disease or fungus, or and then they can use that as a signal that we better do something to take care of our grapes, because we don't want to lose, our grapes and our wine and that whole bit. And I wonder about that with healthy deviants, in that maybe they are in some ways sensitive to the unhealthy default reality, and it makes them sick a little bit sooner, or maybe makes them get depressed or anxious to the point where it becomes unworkable in their lives, and it becomes like the only choice. For me, it's been the only choice is to be a little bit of a healthy deviant, and to be a little bit quirky, as you described, and a little bit odd and a little bit weird in how we do
Yeah.
things in our household.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the healthy deviant practices that we do are like really preserving mealtime. And before a meal, we have a bell and we have silence as a whole family. So friends come over, a 12-year-old boy will come over to my house, and we're like, hold on, we got to ring the bell and breathe. And we read these little contemplations before eating about being aware and conscious of where our food comes from, and eating in a way that reduces climate change. We do this even with a,
Yes.
random friend over, and they think that we're weird and they laugh, almost like I've had to preserve that healthy deviance for my own sake.
Yeah.
And I'd love for you to share your story around this, because you have an interesting one of your journey to healthy
Mm.
deviance. I think a lot of people
Yes.
do, but yeah.
I think everybody's story is really interesting, and how they got to where they got to when. And I think that you have a really interesting point, the rose in the vineyard, that I do believe that a lot of folks who find themselves more sensitive, whether it's to environmental inputs like noise and light and disruption, or chemically sensitive to things like preservatives and fragrances, or spiritually sensitive, who are more aware of the suffering of people around them and have high levels of compassion and find this culture we're living in to be kind of brutal. All of those folks with higher levels of sensitivity, I think, do come to healthy deviance earlier, oftentimes because they have a standard that they need to maintain of well-being in order to not be taken down more dramatically, but in many cases because they've had to develop more sensitive feelers around them, and they look for solutions that make their lives better earlier. Um, so I don't think you're wrong about that. In my case, I grew up in a family of people that really promoted fairly healthy deviant ideas, but well before I called it that. But my father was a sociologist, and he used the term deviant in his teaching a lot to encourage his students to think about what is deviant, what's considered deviant in a given culture is is really situational. It's contextual on the basis of the society you live in. What's considered polite in our culture is considered impolite somewhere else. What's considered taboo in another culture might be completely okay here. And that was an idea that I think stuck with me early on. But my mom was an organic farmer, really wanted to live very close to the land. And that was also considered really weird in the
Mhm.
neighborhood where I grew up in Wisconsin. We really stood out as oddballs and were excluded socially from a lot of activities because people just thought we were really weird. And I felt the pain of that. I think my sensitivity was social. And I wanted really badly to fit in and be accepted and be seen as a successful person, and then as a successful young woman. So I got very attached to the idea of conforming and complying with the culture around me. And I actually found it very irritating that my parents insisted on living in their weird ways and seeing things through sort of weird eyes. But what happened was that as I got old enough to begin making choices for myself, I left behind a lot of the healthy deviant, what for me were default choices in my family. Whole food, in outdoor times outdoors, not having a television, not eating processed food, not wearing makeup, not being too concerned about the way that we looked. I left all that behind, and I went straight into the conventional, like the jaws of the conventional culture, and found myself, as I tried to conform and comply and live up to expectations, I really found myself with my health, my fitness, my mental health all deteriorating. And so physical problems I had never had growing up, I began to develop. You know, irregularities around my digestion, my weight, my hormonal balances, my stress level. And psychologically, I began being less and less confident of myself and more desperate to try and avail myself of all the unhealthy default reality solutions to what I saw as my problems. My skin isn't perfect. I need a cream. My weight isn't perfect. I need a diet aid. I had all of these notions. So the more I complied with the culture, the less healthy and happy I got. And finally, my hero's journey, I call it a healthy deviant hero's journey. My sort of bottom, my rock bottom moment was one where I got very upset with myself because I wasn't able to fit in all of the things I thought I had to do, like the right diet, the right exercise program, and get enough sleep and get enough time outdoors and do my job and take care of the things I had to take care of in my family life. And I got so upset with myself, feeling that I must be a failure, that I could never make this work. I stomped my foot really, really hard on a wooden floor, so hard that I actually broke a bone in my foot. And I describe in the book how this experience of breaking my own bone led me to really reflect on the larger pattern of self breakage that I had been living in for years and not acknowledging, not realizing the extent to which I had been breaking myself down by living in the unhealthy default reality and accepting its standards and its problems and its solutions as my own. So that was for me the beginning of it was a turning point, which all healthy deviants experience at some point, is a willingness to diverge from the normal, to deviate from normal. And I began experimenting then with different approaches, including more integrative medicine approaches, functional medicine approaches, thinking more holistically about my nutrition, my movement, my sleep, my stress management, rather than seeing them all as disconnected things I had to do. I ended up re-embracing a lot of the lessons I learned as a child, but in a way that worked for me in my adult modern life and living in the city rather than on a farm, and having a job and really trying to figure out, like I said, how do you do this nearly impossible thing of being a healthy person in an unhealthy culture. And that for me, led me to the phase of my own healthy deviant hero's journey that I am in now, and that I'm helping others find their way to, which I consider it to be kind of a post-rebellion phase, like after you've gotten mad at the military industrial complex, and after you've gotten mad at the aisles of junk food, and you've gotten mad at conventional medicine. You just wear yourself out being angry, and you realize, I have to conserve my energy and choose my battles, and I have to do it from a condition that is high resilience, high vitality, or I will never get anywhere. So first, I have to reclaim my own mojo. Then I need to raise my game, raise my standards of my how healthy I want to be and what I even define health as. And then it's stepping into this phase, sort of like the be the change phase, where you inhabit your own healthy deviant identity. You begin building a healthy deviant community of people who don't think you're weird, who actually support you and celebrate your choices and are excited to find out, like, oh, you ring a bell and do quiet before. Oh, I love that. I'm going to try that. And suddenly, instead of being weird, you're finding yourself embraced. And you're also finding yourself contributing to other people's path, which is really profoundly gratifying in the world that we live in, to be a participant in the healing of a community or a family or a workplace or a larger culture. That is what healthy deviance is all about.
There's a line that I often use with clients, and it kind of traces back to Paul Gilbert, but I've modified it, as we often modify things. It's that it's not your fault. You're doing everything that society has told you to be healthy and happy and feel good, and you feel terrible, and it is your responsibility to climb out of it. Like there's no one else will take responsibility, even though
Yep.
it's not your fault, and most of this is contextual. So on my
Yeah.
end of things, I don't get people coming into my office, although it's very much a co-occurring condition with sort of the health stuff. Like they come in with anxiety and gut problems, or they come in with
Yes.
depression and fatigue and low energy and difficulty with sleep, right? Or they come in with lack of sexual
Yes.
interest and disconnection from their partners, right? So, but what I see is that psychology has been as much the problem as medical providers, because psychology does the same kind of thing of like, do this and this and this, change the way that you think, and then that will make you happier. And we have to take a much more integrative approach than just these whack-a-mole solutions. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the approach to being a healthy deviant. And in your book, you give a lot of things that folks can do, one of which I've been paying a lot of attention to since reading your book, which is our ultradian rhythms. So developing this awareness of our own body and the way in which our body shifts and changes over the course of the day and what our body's needs are. Can we start there with the awareness, the first part of becoming a healthy deviant?
Yeah. Absolutely. And Diana, I'm really glad you chose that example because I think this awareness of our pre-programmed physical rhythms, it's such a great example of how we're programmed out of something that is just inherently, you can't get rid of it. It's like eye blinking or heart beating. Your body is designed to work and programmed effectively to work according to these very interesting natural rhythms. People have heard of circadian rhythms often, and I always like to begin there so that they understand ultradian rhythms are like circadian rhythms in that they happen regularly and they happen to everyone, and our bodies are functioning around them all the time. But ultradian rhythms happen many times throughout the day. And the term ultra, meaning many, dea, ultradian, dea is day. So many times throughout the day, we have this rhythm that's about 90 minutes of relatively high energy and productivity and focus that is followed by about 20 minutes of what we experience as low energy, lower like fatigue like or lower levels of attention, lower levels of mental focus. And then if you were willing to embrace that downtime and take a break, your body uses the break to rehabilitate, rebalance, renourish, reorganize a lot of different systems within the body. And by that, I mean systems like your digestive system, your neurological system, your metabolic system, your cardiovascular system, all the glandular systems. One of the things that they're very helpful in resolving are some of the most widely spread problems and complaints of the day, including attention, mood, energy complaints. And what happens is when people begin experimenting with what I call ultradian rhythm breaks, they have just incredible turnarounds, often in all of those areas at once. And they're like, wait a minute, did I take a crazy drug? What is this thing? No, what happened is you just got into agreement with a body rhythm that has been there all along. You've just been fighting it because you've been trained to fight it by a culture that has programmed us to believe we should be always on, consistent in our energy, constantly going, getting as much done as possible. And we are largely judging ourselves each time we begin to experience the first signs of fatigue or low energy or reduced mental capacity, cognitive function, memory, and so on. So let me just walk you through what the rhythm looks like, and then we can talk about the signals that you might need an ultradian rhythm break and how to take one. So if you imagine most people get up in the morning and they get their coffee and they start kind of getting into go, go, go mode. And when they first start work, let's say they start work at 9 o'clock, they're focused and energized and they're ready to go, they're motivated. And they do really well for the first hour and a half or so. And then about an hour and a half in, they begin having a declining capacity. They start feeling fatigued or distracted. They have a hard time getting the same things done in the same amount of time they did an hour ago. And a lot of people at this point start to panic because they're like, it's only 10:30 in the morning. Why am I already tired? Like, I can't do this. I have a whole day of work ahead of me. So we run to get coffee or we get sugar in our system and we just force ourselves to keep going. What happens in that normal, so-called normal scenario, is that we do experience our energy and focus returning. Again, we pass over that 20 minutes without the break, but we still end up coming back up again because, again, it's just programmed into our system. So we return to a slightly higher level than we were in the dumps of our low spot, but we never get back to the original high place we were at a beginning of our day. And this goes on throughout the day. Another half an hour, another hour and a half later, we are in a bigger slump. If we may take a lunch break, maybe we come back from lunch feeling better. But most people don't. They eat at their desk or they eat while they're scrolling on their phone. So again, you miss this break. And each time you miss the break and you skip it, you end up with diminishing returns. So that by the end of the day, people have another slump around 2:30, another slump around 5 before they're going home. And they typically get home in this unbelievably depleted, reactive, miserable, inflamed place. And that's right about the time they encounter their partner, who's also probably coming home from or has been sitting in the same kind of low, depleted energy place. So a lot of our relating with other people, the people closest to us, happen at this time of day where we got nothing in the tank. So let me give you the other scenario, which is that the first part of coming into your day is known as arousal, which is a lovely term, but basically you're kind of building up to your first peak. You go through an hour and a half of high productivity, high focus, and then you start to feel the byproducts of all that productivity. That's what is happening in your body, is your body is getting you things like cellular debris, metabolic waste, neurosynaptic snippets of bits of information that are building up in your confused, clouded brain. And your body is giving you the signal of fatigue and stress and disorder to get you to take this break. So let's say you're a healthy deviant and you know about this and you're like, oh, I recognize the signs that my body needs a 20-minute break. And then you actually take a walk around the block without your cell phone, or you lie down on a yoga mat in your office, or you sit in your chair and look out the window and do some deep breathing, or you listen to a guided meditation or something that gets you to breathe and relax your body mind. And while your body is relaxing, what's happening is that it is cranking into a high gear of cleanup and rebalancing, reorienting, reorganization. Your brain goes through the inbox and connects all the different wires that need to be connected. You suddenly have like, oh, I just got a good idea of how to solve that problem. Or your body goes like, oh, I feel so much better. And you will now, because you've taken the break, find yourself returning to another 90 minutes of high productivity and high focus and high capacity. Is it magic? No. It's just getting into agreement with the way that your body mind works and getting out of agreement with how you've been programmed by our culture to believe it should work. It's extraordinary.
It's extraordinary, and it does change the way your day ends. Because I'm a healthy deviant, even though I didn't know I was a healthy deviant, I've learned this about my body. And for me, just paying attention to my body around 11 o'clock. If I don't take a break, I will go up to my kitchen and I'll start opening cupboards and then want to get like a little something before I go back to work. Or I'll start to notice my irritability and my attention is off in my with my client, and I'm less able to track them or sit with them and really feel with them and be present. So I definitely have noticed that time around 11, and then also around 3:30 in the afternoon, right when I'm done with work, before I go to pick up kids or before kids are coming back. Those are sort of the two main times where if I don't tend to my body's needs, and for me, it's simple. It's just go out and water the garden. That's my break. It just feels good to hold a hose over a plant and not think about anything. Or I go down and like see if there's any eggs in the chicken coop and then walk back up. Or just sort of, it's not always meditating and doing yoga, but just doing something that is slow, moves my body a little bit. In the 3 o'clock one, it is usually like a lie down situation, like lie on the floor and put my legs up for a minute and just close my eyes and do nothing. But you get recharged. It is true. I definitely have felt that in my own experience, and the science supports it. So Alyssa Epple, who's at UCSF, she talks a lot about cellular restoration and what they're finding in terms of these deep rest states what happens in your body in terms of the restoration, that we need the good stress, we need little bits of good stress, and then we need which she calls deep rest to restore. It feels impossible. It feels weird. People are going to think, what are you doing? Why are you taking so many breaks? But then you are so much more productive at your work and do a better job when you are working if you start to listen to your body's signals.
Now, both because the science is finally getting more publicized, it's been around for a long time. I mean, a lot of the early research on this was done back in the 80s, and a lot of it has been done by the military, interestingly, for reasons you can probably imagine. But I think that that awareness that you're describing of your own body, like, I'm becoming too fatigued, or when I take this rest, I feel restored and recharged and more capable. Even that level of awareness is a deviant thing to do, to demonstrate. Because think about how much more attention and energy we have going into our digital devices and the alerts and buzzers and even the biometric devices that we have. We know how many beats a minute because we're looking at something telling us. We know what our recovery rate is because of something that's telling us. But we often have not really been trained to notice the signs of fatigue or irritation or reactivity. And until you can begin to pay attention to those things and respect them as useful bits of information, it's really difficult to then know what to do about it. And what I suggest doing about it is called preemptive repair. And this is really a good example of what Ultradian Rhythms do. You start getting ahead of the damage rather than reacting to it once it's already done. You start preparing for the reality that you're living in an inflammatory culture, that you're living in accordance with cycles that are not your body's preferred ones. And you begin adjusting in little bits and experimenting to see what happens. And I think that idea that you get to experiment and see what happens and notice on the day that you take the break. Do you feel better on the day that you don't take the break? When you get a healthy snack in before you're ravenously hungry, do you not have the same tendency to go for the crazy thing that you would eat otherwise? And those kinds of things take attention and awareness that are hard resources for a lot of people in our culture to gather and collect for their own use because they're being dissipated and sucked up by the unhealthy default reality all the time.
There's a concept in the work that I do as a psychologist, which is creative context sensitivity. And what creative context sensitivity is being aware of different contexts, what your yearnings are, like what inside of your body is telling you what you need, whether it's a yearning for health or a yearning to belong or a yearning to have a sense of understanding or yearning to feel something. And these show up in all different contexts. They can show up in a meeting, they can show up when you're with your partner, they can show up when you're alone. And we've been taught to not be sensitive, to actually be insensitive to our inner yearnings. And then we've also been taught to have sort of a one way of responding to those yearnings. So we don't have a flexible repertoire. And sometimes it's watering plants to get my yearning to connect to nature, but sometimes it's going and hiking, like, where I'm not going to see anyone at all. Sometimes it's just lying in my bed when I wake up first thing and listening to the birds, right? That those are all different behaviors that are meeting this yearning to connect to nature. And that's what I really enjoy about the Healthy Deviant, because you haven't given us one path to follow or one prescription of how to do this, but rather are saying there's many paths in the Healthy Deviant journey. And it starts with awareness, and then it starts with trying out different things, and then maybe retaining the things that work for you and using them in many different contexts.
That's exactly right. And that's, again, I am not trained as a psychologist or as a medical professional of any kind, but I've been fascinated by and following the research in all of these disparate areas of psychology and neuroscience and immunology and, sociology for as long as I can remember. And I'm really intrigued by how many overlapping places you can get affirmation for what you just described, which is like, if I pay attention, if I listen to the longing, the appetite, the desire, the need, I pay attention, I find ways of meeting that, experiment with what works best. And then you're embracing continuous growth and learning, broaden and build. And that's like one of the nonconformist competencies of healthy deviance is like, I keep learning all the time. I just experiment and see what works. I'll try something else. To me, it's about autonomy and your willingness as a human being to choose a path, your choice of path, and to continue to have the freedom to shift gears or shift pathways or shift priorities based on your changing conditions on the ground, the changing context, your changing life stage, the new thing that you just learned that makes you completely open up your mind to things you might never have considered otherwise. And just realizing that just because you have not done it this way in the past or you weren't encouraged to do it this way in the past doesn't mean you can't do it this way now and see how it works for you. I also think that the skills of living with a healthy mind and a healthy body, those skills need to be imparted throughout our lifetimes. It would be so helpful if we had more examples as children of a diversity of people living different ways who were all healthy and happy and could explain why that worked for them. Or you could just witness it and be like, oh, that's what a healthy, happy person looks like. Most of us are growing up without that. You know, if you really think about it, from the time you're in grade school, look at how stressed out our teachers are. Look at how stressed out our parents are. Look at how stressed out our friends are, our friends' families. You know, and every step of the way, we're learning how to survive, not thrive in this culture. And it's really contributing to the culture moving in directions that are even less sustainable and less rewarding. What's happening is that we're realizing we need to learn and master and teach skill sets that have never had to be actively taught before, but they're the same skills that our forebears needed to survive. Also, in some cases, like how do you eat whole food? How do you get enough rest? How do you accomplish the things you want to accomplish without wearing yourself down and creating a net drain on your family and community? So I call them the
Yeah.
skills of the healthy person. And I do think that they're very much culturally, contextually defined, but they've never had to, these particular skills of living in this society have never had to be taught before because we've never lived this way before. Yeah.
So to catch up with the cultural evolution that's happening, that's a mismatch for our slower brain and body evolution, right? The evolutionary mismatch that is occurring, we actually do need to, as parents and as friends and as communities, purposefully do some things that we didn't have to purposely do because they were built into our lives. And it's counterculture to do some of these healthy deviant things. Recently, the pediatrician told my son that what she's seeing more and more is children's shoulders that are pointing to forward instead of children's shoulders that are pointing to the side. So your shoulders shouldn't point in a diagonal to the corner of the room. They should point outward because children are using way more technology and then these forward necks. So she's seeing the impact of this on the spine. And she said, you know, back in the day, a adult would tell children in classrooms, sit up straight, children, work on your posture. You know, remember the books on the heads and all these things that actually were taught. And my son, because we had spent some time at this monastery, and he said, "Oh, when we would go in and work with the nuns, they would tell us, sit beautifully, children. Let me see you sit as beautifully as you can." And all the children would sit up straight and hold their heads in line. And it was another way, it was like a less punitive way, but of encouraging this. It's in some ways like healthy deviant to sit up straight and have your chin in line with your spine. And we see the consequences long term. So here's a pediatrician warning us that if you continue on this path when you're 60, you're going to have some problems. You know, you'll have back problems. But there's so many
If you get to
different
60.
things. If you get to 60, there's so many different little things like that. And as a parent, I feel the pressure of society more as a parent than I do in my other roles, and the pressure to be like everyone else, because there's a lot of fear if I don't overschedule my kid will get left out, or we have really preserved bedtime and turning down the lights and making evenings be quiet, but he has all this homework he has to do all of a sudden. And so this productivity that's being fed to our children early on, and I think as parents we struggle with it ourselves, but then we see it happening with our kids. It's hard to be a healthy deviant. So how do you work with people on that in terms of this is hard stuff and not everyone else is on the same page?
Well, I think one thing is, trusting your instincts as a parent. Like if you look at your kids and you can see they're starting to, I mean, physically and or emotionally starting to shut down, those are that's a signal to me that whatever it is that is being asked of that kid is too much for the level of recovery opportunity or the inputs that are going in. And again, some of this is like nutrition, right? If we are the kids, we know how poorly kids tend to get fed at school, and many kids get not fed well at home either.
Sports. Actually, it's sports where they get fed the worst. I'm not kidding you. Bubble gum and red vines and Gatorade to go out on that
Terrifying.
field. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awful. Well, and they've done
Yeah.
these really interesting studies, where at every level, here in Wisconsin, they did an intervention with whole food based lunches and saw an extraordinary drop off in what they thought of as behavior problems. They did interventions with yoga and meditation and saw kids having radical changes in mood and ability to learn. And so we know what works. We can see kids need sleep. They do need inputs like healthy food. And what is promised, what is presented by the unhealthy default reality is pretty much the opposite of what they need. So, yeah, if you're going to raise healthy kids, you have a challenge as an adult parent of like, how do you set up systems in your own life, in your own home, when your own life is completely unsustainable because you're overworked and overburdened and have 3 jobs and a bunch of other, you're caregiving for your aging parents and your marriage is falling apart because everybody is stressed. That's hard in and of itself as a parent. But then you've got the kid who is being encouraged to think of red vines and Gatorade and bubble gum as like the normal thing that you do when you're on a sports team, going through the drive-in to get McDonald's hamburgers on the way back from the game. So many of these things are programmed in to the daily lives of children, and them thinking that dinosaur-shaped chicken tenders that are basically pre-chewed and breaded and fried to be the most inflammatory and the most addictive, easy to chow a million of foods. All of these things work against our kids' health, but they will fight their parents for the right to be normal, much like I fought my
Mhm.
parents in 1970 something when it wasn't even as bad as it is now. So this is one of the reasons that I advocate for acknowledging that this is not just a you problem or a me problem. This is an us problem, and our kids are part of that us. They experience it differently than we do. A lot of kids cannot go to sleep without their phone in their hand because they're so terrified they're going to miss something or they're going to not respond to a text and then their friends are going to get mad at them. That even if you take the phone out of their hand, they still can't sleep because they think they should have the phone in their hand. You know what I mean? And that's how do you get underneath? How do we re educate kids to understand that there's a thing called a society that makes you think you need to be something you're not, that will make you completely insane by the time you're an adult? Like, this is the stuff I think we really should be teaching in schools. And there's a bunch of reasons, economic and otherwise, why we've been doing it the way we've been doing. We're training our kids to be good little producers and good little consumers. We're not really training them to discover who they are as human beings and become the best version of that self. That is a radical, deviant thing to do. And it is disruptive. And you will fight probably, it sounds like you got a good pediatrician, but a lot of people end up fighting the school administrators, fighting their doctors, fighting the coach on the team, fighting whomever. That takes energy and resilience and enthusiasm and determination that are pretty hard to marshal when you're already
Yeah.
overwhelmed and exhausted and depleted. So the answers that I propose in Healthy Deviance begin with awareness. Like, notice what's going on inside and around you. Look at what's happening to our society, to our planet, to our communities. Okay, now take a step back. And then the second big piece is preemptive repair. What little ways can you begin getting ahead of this damage before you get depleted and worn out? Starting very first thing in the morning with 3 minutes that are just 3 minutes. I call it the morning minutes practice. But I've had so many people tell me that 3 minute practice when they begin doing it is the first time that they've come into contact with what they feel like is them themselves. And it's kind of foreign at first, like to not be doing something productive, to just be doing something enjoyable for those first 3 minutes before they plug into this unhealthy default reality. And I think that's the starting place. From there on, everything else is like continuous growth and learning, like we were talking about earlier, Diana. It's like, what skill do I need? What awareness do I need to develop? What support systems do I need to bring on board? What processes can I start getting into to make my days go better?
I had a similar experience of a very nourished childhood of parents that were, I mean, my mom used to cook little mini fish and make us dip it in ketchup and eat the whole fish with the bones and all. And she'd put an anchovy in every salad dressing that she made. And she would say things like, oh, I would never buy salad dressing. Who would buy salad dressing, right?
Yep.
I had no idea that this would later be shown to be really beneficial for our health. But we deviate from what our parents, we all have to rebel against our parents, and then we come back to it again. So when we're working on this sort of way of being within ourselves, it does get transmitted to our children, and it does get transmitted to others. And it is exhausting to be always battling the norm. And I don't know if that is always helpful. Sometimes put that
Yeah.
energy into, okay, in my little world, what can I do today if I'm looking at just the day ahead that would be paying attention
Yeah.
to my ultradian rhythm, or that would be maybe responding a little bit differently than I usually respond when stress shows up, listening in, being aware. The approach that we're talking about is not a diet or restrictive, or in saying that there's good foods, bad foods, whatever that is part of the unhealthy default reality. So that you take a middle path or a different path that is not on the side of restrictive eating and food police, and is also not on the side of saying that the way that our environment and our food supply is set up is okay and healthy for us. And that's what it's a
Yes.
really fresh perspective that is needed right now for
Yes.
folks.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I'm
Yeah.
really glad that you said that too, because um, that was, I think, the thing that really took me down my unhealthy path. You know, when I said I got to rock bottom, the food weight stuff is often for most people like the most vicious, unavoidable kind of unhealthy default reality. And it's in both, like I said, it's both spectrums. It's all of the opportunities that you have to eat in ways that degrade you and depress you and demoralize you and make you feel helpless, whether that's eating not enough, eating too much, eating the wrong so-called wrong stuff. It really is like, I don't encourage people to begin with changing their diet, even though a lot of people are like, it all starts with the food. Unless it doesn't. To me, I think where it starts is amplified awareness and noticing how out of control you might feel around your eating and how much misery there might be for you mixed up in what is meant to be a pleasurable experience. And deciding that you can get back to a healthy relationship with it, but it might not begin with a food intervention. It really might begin with an awareness intervention and a recovery, rest, reclamation intervention. From there, anything is possible. So, yeah, good disclaimer.
Yeah, good disclaimer. So there's lots of resources. Folks can start with the quiz, Are You a Healthy Deviant? There's a toolkit that people can download for free. And then there's the book and an app. And we'll make sure to put all of your resources, and including your podcast, in the show notes so that people can start. It's going to be a never ending journey, and you're going to have fun, because I've had so much fun. I'm just getting started with the Healthy Deviant materials.
Well, clearly your hardcore healthy deviance is shining through brightly, and I really want to acknowledge anybody that has begun this path and found it, like, oh, this is just too hard, or I can't keep up with all of these different things. I really suggest I say start where you are and start with small scale things. Like, I don't encourage people to dive into healthy deviance and do it all at once. Like, radically change your diet, radically change your movement patterns, radically change your sleep patterns. These small interventions, in my experience, have been more rewarding, and they really teach you everything you need to know to make all of the bigger scale changes. And then suddenly, instead of it being hard and painful and like a losing battle, it really starts to feel like a fun discovery experiment process where you're getting better as you go. And to me, that's the only way out of this. You have to reclaim some of that lost mojo to be able to be up for the other battles to come. And I don't mean to design it either as a battle. I think, to me, I always say it's more like a dance. It's learning how to do a really good tango. It takes skills, but it's also gratifying. It can be a really fun flow process rather than a learned helplessness process. So thank you for taking an interest in it, Diana, and for being a healthy deviant and sharing all of this out with your communities. I'm really glad to have our worlds overlap.
Okay, well, I'm feeling a need for an ultradian break. I bet you are too. So we should probably close this up. And again, appreciate you for being on the show and can't wait to keep learning from you and staying connected to your work.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Diana. I really appreciate it.